සිංහලෙන් දෙමළෙන් උතහන්න පුළුවන්. මගේ දෙමළ එච්චර හොඳ නෑ. මං try කරන්නම් answer කරන්න. So I'm going to do this in English, but please ask questions in Sinhala or Tamil. But what I've been told is that many don't know the concept, transitional justice. So we are going to go through what it is, but I'm not going to do a lecture. It's going to be an interactive session, and I'm going to be asking your questions. So you all have to pay attention as to what it is. So first of all, is the translations working? First, yes, everyone can understand. Now I've sent a small poster around to help you all understand some of what I'm going to be speaking about. So hopefully you all have a copy. And there's at the back a glossary of terms which is in all 3 languages, which will help you when you go back to understand some of these terms, some of the words that may be new to you. Because a lot of these terms, while we may speak about it, I'm a lawyer, I speak about some of the legal terms, it's very new. So it's very also important for you to have a sense of what is being talked about. Because let's face it, transitional justice in itself is a very technical term. What we are trying to understand now is why it's not a new term. In Sri Lanka, transitional justice has been used, has been discussed in different concepts, different ways. Globally, it has been also discussed in different ways. So this is not something that came about in the last 3 years. That is the first thing you need to understand. Transitional justice, if we think about it, has been there for several decades. In South Africa, how many know there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Desmond Tutu. One? Only one? Come on. A few more? Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you too many questions, but what I'm trying to show you is South Africa went through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and had many other initiatives, which is transitional justice. Nepal, Cambodia, Bosnia, Northern Ireland, they all went through this process. Sri Lanka, we had something called the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, LLRC. How many know about that? More than one, hopefully? Yes, a few. The Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, LLRC, was a commission of inquiry. That's to find out the truth. That is part of transitional justice. So don't think of it as something completely new. These initiatives have actually come to some of the areas you come from. Some of the universities you study in have had some conversations. So what we'll do in the next 40 minutes is just have a quick conversation as to, and I'm sorry this is very small, but I'll go through some of this. So the first slide is really talking about the fact that there are 4 pillars in transitional justice. That's why this will help more than that actually. The first is right to know the truth. Second is, so right to know is orange. Justice, right to justice is yellow. Reparations is the brown one. And non-recurrence, the 4th pillar, is green. And what this shows is what the government, question is what's the government at the moment, let's not go into that, but what the government has committed to. Now, how many know of the Office for Missing Persons, OMP, that was established? You know, okay, couple of people know. Office for Missing Persons. Does someone want to say what the OMP is? Do you want to say to the rest of the group what the OMP is? You said you know? No? Does anyone want to say to the group what the OMP stands for? Office for Missing Persons, what it's meant to do? It's been in the news. I'm assuming you all look at the news. No?
Collect information and give to the government that report, and they don't do anything.
They don't do anything. Okay, not quite right. The Office for Missing Persons is the first independent office established by a law in 2016. The law was passed in 2016 in Parliament to establish the first permanent independent mechanism to look at thousands of cases of disappearances. Sri Lanka has a huge caseload on disappearances and missing persons. We've had several commissions of inquiry. LLRC looked at the issue of disappearances. The OMP was set up by law, started working this year in March, and that has just started to look at the issue of missing disappearances. It's not reporting to the government, it's an independent office to look at the issue, but where victims who have experienced, who've lost loved ones can go. So the Office for Missing Persons comes under the orange, which is right to know. When someone's loved one goes missing, is disappeared, one has to investigate. A lot of the victims will say, we don't know what happened. From some of the areas you come across Sri Lanka, this is not just one particular area. Office for Missing will go across Sri Lanka. But OMP comes under one of the pillars. It can't do all of this. It looks at this. Huh? Now, the government in October also sent legislation to Parliament and passed the Office for Reparations Act. That's the second mechanism which comes under this, the brown one. So the government has created two mechanisms. The OMP under orange, the Office for Reparations under brown. But the brown one, Office for Reparation, is the one. They haven't still appointed the people for that because it's only a few weeks where the law has been passed. But first to remember, transitional justice is where when a country goes through a war or conflict, there are many questions, there are many injustices. Communities go through much and they need to then reconcile, ask questions, find out the truth, get compensation. Some are displaced. In Sri Lanka, many, thousands, tens of thousands were displaced from their homes. When people are not able to live in their homes, when they need compensation, that comes under reparations. So transitional justice is for a country that has experienced violence, experience uncertainties, have many questions in terms of what happened in the past, have many issues in terms of seeking justice. Justice is extremely important because if you don't hold perpetrators to account, there's impunity. Sri Lanka is going through that problem. But justice alone is not going to get you reconciliation. Many people will say they want to find out what happened to their loved ones, they want to go home, they want to rebuild lives. that is reconciliation. And for reconciliation to happen, you have to have the transitional justice 4 pillars. Non-recurrence is important because you don't want to go through another cycle of violence. So right to know, to find out what happened, justice to ensure it doesn't happen, those who did the wrong is held accountable, those who need to go home, those who need compensation, reparations, and to ensure we don't go back to violence, non-recurrence. These are just terms, just remember that. You don't need to understand the technicalities, just understand what it is. But if you only have right to know, if you just find out what happened, but there's nothing to prevent violence from happening in the future, that's not reconciliation. If you get people back to their homes, but the security situation is the same, that's not reconciliation. So what you need to remember is these 4 are interconnected. They are not separate. If any government says we can only do one and that's fine, that's not good enough. So if they say we'll have a truth commission and that's going to solve the problems, that's not going to solve the problems. South Africa had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's the first one I asked. Do you know what happened? But South Africa still continues to have problems. So if you only do one and not the other 3, there's going to be problems. The other thing with transitional justice is it's not going to be done overnight. You can't say in 2015 we'll do transitional justice and 2018 you think it's going to be all done. No. This is not something you check boxes. For university students, it's also important to understand your generation will start talking about it, but it may take another generation or another generation when it all happens. So just remember the 4 terms. We'll go through some practical issues. But also to remember, as I said, this is not new. Several countries that I have listed went through transitional justice or going through transitional justice. So this is not something you do as a project and say, okay, in 1 year we are going to do transitional justice. No. Intergenerational. Several decades. Argentina first started on transitional justice in the 1980s by having a commission to look at the disappearances. They're still going through trials. They're still trying to find out what happened to those who disappeared. That's more than 3 decades after, 30 years after, they're still going through that process. Chile, Guatemala, Peru. Now the first 4 countries, and there are many more, these are just examples, started in the 80s. They're still 1980s. Some of you may have not been even born then. But they're still going through that process. South Africa, Desmond Tutu, had the TRC several years ago, and they're still going through some of the land issues, some of the trials. Cambodia, Khmer Rouge, in the 70s it happened. They're still having trials now. So these are just examples. A lot of regions have gone through this. But these are merely examples to show that it's a long-term process. It's gone through several countries, and those countries are still going through transitional justice. So why do we need transitional justice in Sri Lanka? We've had several, as I mentioned very early, we've had some experiences. I'll go through that in a bit. But I said, if you don't address some of the root causes of violence, of conflict, it keeps repeating. We've seen violence even after the end of the war. Even this year in Kandy, we saw violence. So if you don't address the root causes, you're going to have cycle after cycle. Maybe not every month, but you're going to have it. So transitional justice, the broad concept, if you address all four properly, not just say we are going to have commissions, but properly, then you at least address some of the root causes. So to prevent future violence from happening, non-recurrence is the most important. For any citizen in the future to be able to live in peace, without violence, you need to address non-recurrence. But many victims will say that you can't just shut down the past. Some, even politicians, will say what happened in the past is the past. We look to the future. But if you ask someone who has gone through violence, who has lost a loved one, or who has lost a home, you have to address what happened, the past wrongs, the grievances. So addressing what happened in the past is important. Recognizing, acknowledging. You can't just say Sri Lanka didn't go through violence. That's important. To recognize communities went through violence, some continue to face challenges, and that recognition helps at least that process of reconciling. Understanding how different communities experience the past, that's part of transitional justice. So what people in Colombo experience to what people in Mullaitivu or Ampara or Matara, Kurunegala experience is very different. We cannot just equate just because one community or one village experience something the other understand. There has to be empathy. And there also has to be recognition that some communities went through and continue to go through certain challenges, certain threats. And that is critical as well for transitional justice, for reconciliation. As I said, no specific time period. Don't think in 5 years, next year we come to the end of the 10 years since the end of the war. By 10 years, everything is going to be fine. There is no deadline. In 20 years, there may still be problems. There may not be if we get it right, but there may be. So there is no time period, no deadline. Next one is the 4 pillars. This is what I spoke about, the 4 pillars. In a way, think of the colors. Think of the colors as the 4 pillars. So what I said before, one is connected to the other. Just addressing one, many lawyers will say if you hold trials, then it's fine. As a lawyer, I'll say no, it's not fine. So you have to have the 4 pillars connected. Now, I mentioned in the earlier slide, there's been other countries that have gone through. There's also people who keep saying, oh, we have to have the South African model, or we have to have that model. No. We can look at the models, but it also has to be Sri Lanka context specific. What works for Sri Lanka? And who knows best what works for Sri Lanka? It's Sri Lankans. So we can talk about other experiences, but it has to be relevant to Sri Lanka. What may have worked in Bosnia is not going to work directly in Sri Lanka. We have to fine-tune it to see how it will work for Sri Lanka. Addressing post-war issues. Now, many will say transitional justice is what happened during the war. It ends with May 2009. Transitional justice is not an artificial thing where I say, end of the war, that's it. No, you look at what happens even in the post-war period. What happens now? What's happening now? What's happened in the past? even after May 2009, is relevant. So it's very important, all of these issues are important to understand. This is not just saying, oh, we've done these 4 colors, the 4 pillars, we'll do it in 5 years, we'll do it in 10 years. We pass a law, we set up a mechanism. No, that's just not going to work. That's wasting everyone's time. It's really understanding what will work for Sri Lanka, for Sri Lankans to be involved, to have the right institutions, but to ensure that you also do it in a genuine way. So very quickly, as I said, now many will say, well, transitional justice is new. As I said, it's not new. We have had several initiatives in the past which have looked at different aspects of transitional justice. So the first one, commissions of inquiry. Now I spoke about the LLRCs. That's the most recent that some people would know because it went around parts of Sri Lanka. The disappearances commissions that were there many decades ago, before you all maybe. The Paranagama Commission, which looked at the missing persons. Now this is all truth-seeking bodies. The first one, commissions of inquiry, comes under the first one. Now these were set up in the 1990s, in 2005, 2010. So we already had aspects of transitional justice in Sri Lanka. We've had prosecutions. We've gone through cases in our own courts. May have not worked, all of them. There's been acquittals. But having the court system, taking cases to the court system is part of transitional justice. We've had it before. We've also had initiatives where people have been able to be compensated. People have received compensation. There are problems with the compensation schemes. People will say it's not enough. People will go and say, well, this hasn't addressed my needs. But what I'm trying to say is, it's something that we have had in the past. It's not new. And then we've also had several attempts at drafting laws, drafting constitutions. We are going through a constitutional reform process, but we've also had constitutional reform processes before. And that's why the non-recurrence, which is the green pillar, also has been tried out. So what I'm trying to put with this slide is the fact that all of this, over the last 30 years at least, we've had attempts at. We may have not called it transitional justice, but all these 4 pillars at some point or the other have been tried out. So why is this different?